A lonely millionaire proposes marriage to an obese and poor woman, but she discovers something that transforms her life. The aroma of golden garlic and fresh thyme filled the small kitchen at Cooper's Corner as Madison adjusted her sauce-stained apron over her size 46 flower dress. Her nimble hands worked with surgical precision over the cutting board, transforming simple ingredients into little culinary works of art. The restaurant, located in a charming historic brick building in Providence, Rhode Island, was her pride and her prison. "Maddie, there are 2 more returns," announced Rachel, her only waitress, depositing the practically untouched plates on the kitchen counter. The customers said the food was too elaborate. Madison took a deep breath, trying to contain the frustration that threatened to boil over. Her restaurant, which specialized in contemporary reinterpretations of traditional New England dishes, was losing customers to the food trucks and fast food restaurants that had set up shop in the University District. "Elaborate is code for too expensive," muttered Madison, wiping her hands on her apron. A quick glance at the dining room confirmed her concerns. Only 3 tables occupied in the middle of lunchtime. The doorbell jingled, and Madison looked up, hoping for more customers. Instead, she saw Daniel Warren cross the room with the casual elegance of someone used to frequenting much more sophisticated establishments. His tailored Italian suit and watch that probably cost more than a month's rent contrasted with the welcoming simplicity of the place. "Mr. Warren," Madison greeted him, coming out of the kitchen, "I didn't expect to see you so soon after last time." Daniel had dined at Cooper's Corner the week before, ordering the most expensive dish on the menu only to leave it practically untouched. The incident still weighed heavily on Madison's conscience. "Actually," he said, his deep voice carrying a tone Madison couldn't decipher, "I've come to make a business proposition." Madison indicated a discreet table in the corner of the restaurant, away from the few customers present. As they sat down, she couldn't help but notice how the frown lines around his eyes seemed deeper in the daylight, and how his hands, although well cared for, trembled slightly as they rested on the tablecloth. "I'll come straight to the point, Mrs. Cooper," Daniel began, his blue-gray eyes fixed on hers. "I need to get married in the next 30 days, and I'm willing to pay handsomely for the collaboration of the right person." Madison blinked several times, sure that she had misunderstood. "Pardon?" "$1 million, he continued, as if discussing the price of a coffee. "Half now, half after the ceremony. The wedding would last a year at most. No romantic commitments, just a business deal." Madison's heart raced. $1 million would solve all her financial problems: the restaurant debts, the student loan, the physiotherapy treatment her mother so desperately needed. "Why me?" she asked, her voice firmer than she felt. "Because you're authentic," Daniel replied, a half-smile appearing on his lips. "You put your soul into every dish you prepare, even when no one appreciates it. I've seen how you treat your employees and regular customers. Besides," he paused, running his hand through the gray hair at his temples, "I need someone who understands that this is just business." Madison looked at the man in front of her. Daniel Warren, the famous real estate investor, known for turning failing properties into profitable ventures. At 43, he was the kind of man who frequented the social columns of Providence and Newport, always accompanied by models and socialites. "What if I say no?" he asked, more to buy time than out of any real curiosity. Daniel shrugged, an elegant gesture that seemed rehearsed. "Then I'll find someone else. But something tells me you're too smart to pass up an opportunity like that." The silence that followed was interrupted only by the clink of cutlery in the low murmur of other customers. Madison looked out of the window, watching the Brown University students hurrying down the sidewalk, their lives moving forward while hers seemed stagnant. "I need time to think," she finally said. "You have 24 hours, Daniel replied, getting up. He left a card on the table. "My personal number." "And Madison," he paused, his gaze softening for a moment, "this isn't charity, it's a fair exchange." After he left, Madison remained seated, the business card weighing like lead between her fingers. Rachel approached cautiously. "Everything all right, boss?" Madison forced a smile. "Yeah, just thinking about the new menu." That evening, after closing the restaurant, Madison sat on the back stairs, cell phone in one hand and Daniel's card in the other. The cool September air carried the scent of sea air from the nearby port, mixed with the lingering scent of rosemary and sage from her small vegetable garden. Her fingers slid over the keypad of her cell phone, typing in Daniel's number before she could change her mind. He picked up on the first ring. "I accept," she said, surprising herself with the firmness in her voice. "But I have my own conditions." On the other end of the line, there was a brief pause before Daniel replied, "Meet me tomorrow at 9 a.m. in my office. We have a lot to discuss." As she hung up the phone, Madison couldn't shake the feeling that she was about to embark on something much bigger than a simple business deal. What she didn't know was that this decision would change not only her life, but also the way she saw love, sacrifice, and the true value of things that can't be bought. Daniel Warren's office occupied the top floor of a skyscraper in Providence, with a panoramic view of the river. Madison nervously adjusted the blazer she had bought at a sale 2 years ago, feeling out of place among so much glass, steel, and marble. "Mr. Warren is with his doctor right now," informed the secretary, a middle-aged woman with perfectly straight hair. "He apologizes for the delay and asks that you wait in his private room." Madison was led down a silent corridor to a room that looked more like a private library. The walls were lined with mahogany bookshelves, and an antique desk dominated the center of the room. Her eyes were drawn to the framed photographs. A younger Daniel next to a woman with a gentle smile, who Madison recognized from the local news as Charlotte Warren, his late wife. "Sorry to keep you waiting," Daniel's voice sounded behind her, huskier than usual. When Madison turned around, she noticed that he looked paler than the day before, with deep circles under his eyes. "Is everything all right?" she asked, genuinely concerned. "Just a routine consultation," he disagreed, taking a seat in a leather armchair. "Shall we discuss your conditions?" Madison took a deep breath, unfolding a piece of paper from her pocket. "First, I want to keep my restaurant. No matter what happens, it's still mine." Daniel nodded. "Of course. In fact, I can help you expand the business if you wish." "Secondly," she continued, "no excessive social events or media exposure. I'm a chef, not a socialite. Reasonable, although some events are unavoidable. And third," Madison hesitated, "I want to know why you really need to get married in 30 days. The truth, Mr. Warren." The silence that followed was dense. Daniel stood up and walked over to the window. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought, watching the city below. "My will," he began, "has a specific clause. If I'm not married by my next birthday, my entire fortune goes to a distant cousin in Newport, Caroline. Well, let's just say she turned everything I've built into a playground for her endless parties." Madison frowned. "Why would you put a clause like that in your will?" "Charlotte," he replied, touching the photograph on the wall. "She always said that purposeless money was a curse. She wanted to ensure that our fortune was used wisely." Something in the way he spoke, a veiled urgency in his words, made Madison feel that there was more to this story. Before she could ask, Daniel changed the subject, presenting a folder of documents. "The prenuptial agreement," he explained. "My lawyers have prepared everything. In addition to the agreed amount, you'll have an account for monthly expenses and—" "I don't want an allowance," Madison interrupted. "The amount agreed is more than enough to save my restaurant. That's all I need." Daniel studied her with a new look, as if seeing her for the first time. "You're different, Madison Cooper." The meeting followed with discussions about practical details: the date of the ceremony, which would be intimate, the living arrangements. Madison insisted on keeping her apartment above the restaurant, and the public appearances necessary to keep up appearances. As she was about to leave, Madison noticed a medicine bottle partially hidden under some papers on the table. The name on the label was complex, something she had never seen before. "One more thing," said Daniel, handing her a gold card. "I need you to accompany me to a charity dinner next weekend. The Providence Art Museum is launching a new wing, and as one of the main donors, my presence is mandatory." Madison felt a knot in her stomach. "I don't have anything appropriate to wear to an event like this." "I've already taken care of that," he replied with a half-smile. "A fashion consultant will be waiting for you tomorrow at Nordstrom. Choose whatever makes you feel comfortable." In the elevator, descending the 40 floors, Madison tried to process everything that had happened. Her phone vibrated. a message from Rachel informing her that 2 more reservations had been canceled at the restaurant. Leaving the building, she almost collided with an elegant woman hurrying in. "Sorry," muttered Madison. "No problem, dear," replied the woman, her aristocratic Newport accent unmistakable. Her eyes, shrewd and calculating, scanned Madison up and down before continuing on their way. Only when she was half a block away did Madison realize where she had seen that face before. In a photo on the social pages next to the caption, "Caroline Warren, scion of the traditional Newport family." That evening, while preparing the mise en place for the dinner service, Madison couldn't stop thinking about the medicine bottle, Daniel's pallor, the rush of the wedding. The pieces of the puzzle were beginning to fit together, forming a picture she wasn't sure she wanted to see. The doorbell rang, announcing the first customer of the evening. Madison adjusted her apron, pushing her worries to the back of her mind. For now, she had a restaurant to run and a reputation to maintain. The future, with all its mysteries and complications, would have to wait. The Providence Art Museum benefit dinner turned out to be more challenging than Madison had imagined. Wearing a dark green velvet dress that elegantly accentuated her curves, she watched the room full of Providence's finest, trying to decipher the curious glances directed at her and Daniel. "Breathe," Daniel whispered, his hand resting lightly on her back. "You look beautiful." Madison noticed that he looked more tired than usual, even under the soft lighting of the salon. Her suspicions about his health were growing by the day, especially after catching him discreetly swallowing some pills a few minutes earlier. "Daniel, darling," a honeyed voice cut through the atmosphere. Caroline Warren approached, her red designer dress hugging her slender body. "What a lovely surprise. And who is your friend?" "Madison Cooper, my fiancé," Daniel announced, his firm tone leaving no room for snide remarks. Caroline's smile froze for an instant. "Fiancé? What unexpected news." "Madison is the chef-owner of Cooper's Corner," Daniel continued, "one of the most authentic restaurants in Providence." Caroline raised a perfectly drawn eyebrow. "Oh, that little establishment near the university? Fascinating. It must be so quaint." Madison felt her blood boil, but years of running a restaurant had taught her to keep her composure. "Actually, we're planning an expansion. Daniel has been very supportive of my culinary vision." A group of doctors passed near them, and Madison didn't fail to notice how one of them glanced worriedly at Daniel before quickly looking away. It was the same doctor she had seen leaving his office a few days ago. "If you'll excuse me," said Caroline, her smile not reaching her eyes. "I need to say hello to some friends." As soon as she had gone, Madison turned to Daniel. "Are you all right? You look pale." "Just tired," he replied, but his hand trembled slightly as he picked up a glass of champagne. "Dinner will be served soon. I think you'll enjoy meeting the museum's executive chef." During dinner, Madison watched as Daniel just played with his food, moving it around his plate without actually eating. Her suspicions were aroused when he discreetly refused the red wine, something she knew to be his favorite drink. "Mr. Warren," a deep voice interrupted her thoughts. It was the doctor Madison had noticed earlier. "Can we talk about that for a moment?" Daniel nodded, standing up with a tense expression. "Excuse me, dear. I'll be back in a moment." Madison waited a few minutes before getting up, claiming she needed to use the toilet. Instead, she followed the sound of voices coming from a side corridor. "The results are not promising," the doctor was saying. "The new treatment in Boston may be your best option now." "We've already decided that, Dr. Phillips." Daniel's voice sounded tired. "I don't want to spend my last months in experiments. I'd rather put everything in order and—" Madison backed away quickly, her heart hammering in her chest. Last few months? The reality of the situation hit her like a punch in the gut. Daniel wasn't just sick, he was dying. Back at the table, she watched him with new eyes. The occasional tremors, the pallor, the rush to the wedding. It all made sense now. He wasn't looking for a wife because of a clause in his will. He was looking for someone to ensure that his fortune didn't fall into the wrong hands after his death. "Is everything all right?" asked Daniel when he returned. Noticing her troubled expression, Madison forced a smile. "Yes, just thinking about the restaurant." That night, after Daniel left her at home, Madison couldn't sleep. Sitting in her small kitchen above the restaurant, she frantically scoured the internet, researching experimental treatments and medical research centers. Her phone vibrated with a message from Daniel. "Thank you for tonight. You were wonderful." Madison stared at the screen, tears forming in her eyes. In just a few weeks, this man had come into her life offering financial help, and now she was discovering that he was the one who really needed it. An idea began to form in her mind. The money Daniel had offered for the wedding, she could use it not only to save her restaurant, but also to help him. Boston wasn't the only city with experimental treatments. There were research centers in New York, Chicago, Houston. "I'm not going to let you give up so easily, Daniel Warren," she muttered to the empty apartment, starting to make notes in her recipe notebook. The restaurant bell rang downstairs, making her jump. Who could it be at that hour? Descending the stairs, Madison found Caroline Warren standing in the middle of the empty hall. "We need to talk," said Caroline, her icy tone contrasting with her artificial smile. "About Daniel, and about what you really mean to him." Madison straightened her shoulders, preparing herself for what was sure to be a very long evening. The game was just beginning, and she had just discovered that the stakes were much higher than she had imagined. The confrontation with Caroline Warren in the empty restaurant played out like a surreal scene. The Newport socialite occupied a chair with the studied grace of someone accustomed to dominating any environment, while Madison stood, her arms crossed in a defensive posture. "I'll be blunt," Caroline began, adjusting her Hermes bag on the table. "Daniel is dying. Advanced stage lymphoma. The doctors have given him a maximum of 6 months. Madison kept her expression neutral, although her heart was pounding. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because, darling," Caroline smiled with false sweetness, "I want you to understand exactly what you're getting into. Daniel has always been a foolish idealist. But this?" She gestured around the restaurant. "Marrying a plus-size chef from a bankrupt restaurant? It's practically an insult to the Warren legacy." "I don't care about legacies or fortunes," Madison replied, her voice firm, "and I certainly don't need your approval." Caroline laughed, a humorless sound. "Oh, but you will. You see, I have proof that Daniel isn't in his right mind. The medication he takes, the side effects can affect judgment. A good lawyer could easily challenge any decision he makes now." Madison felt her blood boil, but years of running a professional kitchen had taught her to maintain control under pressure. "Are you threatening me?" "Just offering an alternative." Caroline picked up her purse, standing up with studied elegance. $2 million. Double what Daniel offered. "All you have to do is call off this circus and disappear." "Get out of my restaurant," Madison ordered, her voice low but laden with determination. After Caroline left, Madison locked the door and went upstairs to her apartment. Instead of sleeping, she spent the night researching experimental treatments for lymphoma. His savings were limited, but the money Daniel had offered could make the difference between life and death, not for his restaurant, but for himself. The next morning, Madison drove to Rhode Island Hospital, determined to speak to Dr. Phillips. She found him leaving an appointment, his dark circles under his eyes showing an equally bad night's sleep. "Miss Cooper," he sounded surprised. "Did Daniel tell you?" "No," she admitted, "but I need to know everything about his condition. There's an experimental program in Houston that—" The doctor interrupted her gently. "Daniel has already turned down all the experimental options. He doesn't want to spend his last months in hospital. What if I could convince him?" Madison insisted. "Doctor, please. There must be something we can do." Dr. Phillips hesitated, then opened his briefcase. "There's a new treatment in development at MD Anderson Cancer Center. The preliminary results are promising, but it's extremely expensive and experimental." Madison looked at the documents he showed her, her heart squeezing as she saw the amounts involved. Why did Daniel refuse this? "He said he'd rather make sure his legacy is preserved," the doctor sighed. "But between you and me, I think he just gave up after he lost Charlotte." That afternoon, Madison canceled the restaurant's lunch service for the first time in 3 years. Instead, she drove to Daniel's mansion in Barrington, an impressive estate by the river. The butler ushered her into the study, where she found Daniel hunched over documents, looking more haggard than ever. "Madison," he smiled weakly, "I didn't expect to see you today." "How long did you plan to hide the fact that you're dying?" she asked bluntly. His smile disappeared. "How? It doesn't matter." Madison approached the table. "What matters is that there is treatment in Houston, and we're going to use the money from our settlement to pay for it." "No," Daniel was firm. "That money is for your restaurant, for your future." "My restaurant can wait," she insisted. "Your life can't." "Madison," he stood up with difficulty, "you don't understand. I've already accepted my fate. I just want to make sure that my fortune goes to someone who will make good use of it, not to Caroline to turn everything into endless parties. And I won't accept being your chosen heir while you give up the fight," Madison retorted, tears threatening to fall. "If you really want me to be your wife, even if only on paper, then you need to listen to me. Because wives don't stand by passively while their husbands give up on life." The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken emotions. Finally, Daniel sat down again, suddenly looking much older and tired. "You look so much like her," he murmured. "Charlotte, that same stubbornness, that strength. Then honor her memory by fighting." Madison grabbed the treatment documents from her bag. "Dr. Phillips gave me all the details. We can start later this month." Daniel examined the papers slowly, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. "What about your restaurant?" "Cooper's Corner has survived 3 recessions and a pandemic," she smiled. "It can handle a few more tough months." At that moment, watching Daniel read the documents with growing interest, Madison realized that her feelings for him had changed. It was no longer just a business deal or a rescue mission. Somewhere between the tense meetings and the painful discoveries, she had begun to truly care about this stubborn and complicated man. "All right," he finally gave in. "But on one condition. The wedding takes place before we go to Houston. I want to make sure you're protected, no matter what." Madison nodded, fighting the knot in her throat. "Agreed. And Daniel?" She waited until he looked her in the eye. "I won't let you give up. Not now, not ever." Madison watched intently as the nurse adjusted the chemotherapy drip in the private room of the MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston. Daniel lay in the hospital bed, his skin even paler against the white sheets, but his eyes held a determined glint that hadn't been there weeks ago. "You don't have to stay here all the time," he said, noticing the dark circles under her eyes. "The restaurant?" "Rachel's taking care of everything," Madison interrupted him, adjusting the blanket over her legs. "Besides, I'm officially Mrs. Warren now, remember?" The ceremony had been held 3 days before they left for Houston, intimate and simple in the garden of the mansion in Barrington. Madison had worn a light blue dress that emphasized her curves, and Daniel, though weakened, had managed to remain standing throughout the brief ceremony. "Speaking of which," Daniel rummaged through his briefcase beside the bed, "I need you to sign some documents. They're to make sure that—" "No," Madison was firm. "No paperwork today. Today, we're just going to concentrate on the treatment." A slight smile appeared on his lips. "You're pretty bossy for someone who's supposed to be just fulfilling a business agreement." The comment hit Madison deeper than she'd like to admit. In the last few weeks, since discovering her illness, her feelings for Daniel had turned into something she wasn't yet ready to name. "Dr. Martinez will be in shortly with the first results." She changed the subject, consulting her phone. "The experimental program seems to be—" She was interrupted by a knock on the door. To her surprise, it wasn't the doctor, but Caroline Warren, impeccably dressed even after a flight from Providence. "Daniel, darling," she exclaimed, completely ignoring Madison. "I came as soon as I heard you'd started treatment. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because it was none of your business," he replied, his voice calm but firm. "Madison is my wife now, Caroline. She makes the medical decisions." Caroline cast an icy glance at Madison. "Yes, I heard about the rushed ceremony. The lawyers are quite interested in that detail, considering your mental state during the signing of the documents." "My mental state is perfectly fine." Daniel straightened up in bed, his voice gaining strength. "And if you really cared, you would have supported my decision to try the treatment, instead of trying to bribe my wife to give up." Madison watched Caroline's face turn pale. "Did you tell him?" asked the socialite, turning to Madison. "No," Madison replied calmly, "but I just did." The silence that followed was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Martinez. carrying a folder of tests. Caroline took the opportunity to leave, but not before casting one last threatening glance at Madison. "The first results are promising," announced the doctor, after examining Daniel. "The tumor is responding to treatment better than we expected." Madison felt her legs weaken with relief. Needing to lean on the wall, Daniel held out his hand to her, and she took it without hesitation. "We still have a long way to go," continued Dr. Martinez. "But if we keep this response—" "We will," Madison affirmed, squeezing Daniel's hand. "No matter what it takes." That night, after Daniel had fallen asleep, Madison received a message from Rachel with photos of the new menu they were testing at Cooper's Corner. The restaurant was holding its own, albeit with difficulties. The savings she had made were almost gone, but every penny spent on Daniel's treatment was worth it. "You really care about him, don't you?" The soft voice of the nurse surprised her. Madison watched Daniel's sleeping face, the worry lines softened by sleep. "More than it should, considering how it all started." "Love rarely follows the plans we make," the nurse replied with a gentle smile. "Love?" The word echoed in Madison's mind as she returned to her place beside the bed. Was that it? Was that why her heart ached every time she saw Daniel struggling with the side effects of his treatment? Was that why she woke up in the middle of the night to check that he was breathing normally? Her phone vibrated again. This time an email from Caroline's lawyer, mentioning a possible challenge to the marriage. Madison deleted the message without reading to the end. She would leave the legal battles for later. Now, her only priority was to ensure that Daniel survived to fight his own battles. "I'm not going anywhere," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "Not even if Caroline hires every lawyer in Rhode Island." The heart monitor maintained its steady rhythm, a comforting reminder that, despite everything, Daniel was fighting. And as long as he was fighting, Madison would be there, turning what had begun as a business deal into something much deeper and truer. The Houston heat was unlike anything Madison had ever experienced, denser and more persistent than Rhode Island summers. From her hospital room, she watched the constant movement of Texas' largest city as she organized her notes on the progress of Daniel's treatment. "You've really turned this room into an office," commented Dr. Martinez, entering for his morning visit. There were organized piles of medical documents, an open laptop with cost spreadsheets, and, on a side table, several books on alternative treatments and cancer nutrition. "I need to keep everything under control," Madison replied, consulting her notebook. The latest tests showed a 15% reduction in the tumor, but the levels of Madison, Daniel interrupted her gently from the bed. "You haven't slept properly for 3 days. Go and get some rest at the hotel." She hesitated, but Dr. Martinez intervened. "He's right. Besides, I need to do some procedures that will take a few hours. It's a good opportunity for you to take a breather." Reluctantly, Madison picked up her bag. Before leaving, she leaned over to adjust Daniel's pillow, a gesture that had become automatic over the last few weeks. Their eyes met briefly, and she felt that familiar tightness in her chest. At the hotel, instead of resting, Madison opened her laptop for a video call with Rachel. "How's the restaurant?" "Surviving," Rachel replied, and Madison could see the Cooper's Corner kitchen in the background. That positive review in the Providence Journal helped. "And how is he?" "Struggling," Madison sighed. "The treatment is aggressive, but it's working." "Rachel, about the money." "Don't even think about it," Rachel cut in. "I took out a personal loan to cover my wages this month. You did the same for me when my mother was ill, remember?" Madison felt the tears she had been holding back for days finally escape. "I don't know what I'd do without you." "Hey boss," Rachel smiled. "When you get back, we're going to make that charity dinner you've always wanted to do a reality. I've already got 3 chefs interested in taking part." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. To her surprise, it was Charlotte Warren Sr., Daniel's mother. An elegant Lady Madison had met briefly at the wedding. "May I come in, dear?" she asked, her Newport accent softened by years of living in Texas. "I just visited Daniel, and he mentioned that you'd finally gone to rest." Madison nodded, closing her laptop. Charlotte took a seat by the window, her eyes studying Madison with interest. "You know," she began, "when Caroline called me furious about the wedding, I imagined the worst. But I've watched you these weeks, looking after my son with a dedication that goes far beyond any financial agreement. Madison hesitated, unsure of how to respond. You don't have to explain, Charlotte smiled gently. I recognize love when I see it. It's the same look I had when I looked after Daniel's father during his illness. Madison felt her face heat up. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. It was just an arrangement. Life rarely follows our plans. Charlotte stood up, moving closer to Madison. Daniel has changed since you came into his life. Before, he'd given up. Now, he fights. And not just for the treatment. She opened her bag, taking out an envelope. This is the result of the last Warren Enterprises board meeting. Daniel was temporarily removed as chairman due to his illness, and Caroline tried to take over. Madison felt her heart race. Did she succeed? No, Charlotte smiled, a cunning glint in her eyes. The board voted unanimously to appoint you as interim president, following Daniel's recommendation. After all, you are legally his wife. But I don't know anything about running a company of that size, protested Madison. You run a restaurant in one of the most competitive cities in the Northeast. You deal with suppliers, employees, and demanding customers. What's more, Charlotte laid a hand on Madison's. You have something Caroline will never have, genuine concern for the legacy my son has built. Before Madison could reply, her phone rang. It was the hospital. Daniel had had a strong reaction to the new medication and was asking for her. Go, said Charlotte, seeing Madison already grabbing her bag. I'll be at the council tomorrow to formalize your appointment. And Madison? She waited until the young woman looked at her. Welcome to the family. Really? On the way back to the hospital, Madison reflected on how her life had changed in just a few weeks. From chef struggling to keep her restaurant open to acting president of one of Rhode Island's largest companies. From a bride of convenience to, what exactly? When she entered Daniel's room, she found him asleep, his face still pale but more serene. She sat down in her usual chair, taking his hand in hers. I'm not going to let anything happen to everything you've built, she whispered. Not with the company, not with you. I promise. Daniel squeezed her hand lightly, although he was still asleep, and Madison knew that, whatever happened from now on, her heart had made its choice a long time ago. The phone call came during one of Daniel's chemotherapy sessions. Madison was organizing her notes on the latest tests when Rachel called, her voice shaking with excitement. The New York Times wants to do a story on Cooper's Corner, exclaimed Rachel. Food critic Amanda Reynolds is in Providence researching authentic family restaurants, and someone mentioned our story. Madison felt her stomach turn. Rachel, I can't go back now. Daniel is… Actually, interrupted Daniel from the hospital bed, where he had apparently been listening to the conversation. You need to go. No way, Madison protested, covering the phone with her hand. We're in the middle of the treatment cycle and the results are positive, added Dr. Martinez, who had just entered the room with a new battery of tests. Actually, Madison, a break of a few days would be beneficial for you. You've been here for 8 weeks without a break. Madison looked at Daniel, noticing how much stronger he looked than in the previous weeks. The experimental treatment was working. The tumor had shrunk significantly, and his blood levels were almost normal. Charlotte can stay with me, Daniel offered, taking her hand. And you need to look after your restaurant. I didn't allow you to sacrifice so much to see it close now. After much debate and promises of constant updates on Daniel's condition, Madison boarded a flight to Providence the next morning. The 3-hour journey seemed interminable, her heart torn between the man she had left behind in Houston and the restaurant that was her lifelong dream. When she arrived at Cooper's Corner, she was surprised to find the place completely transformed. Rachel and the team had kept the cozy essence of the atmosphere, but implemented small changes that made all the difference. Softer lighting, discreet floral arrangements, and a new menu that mixed Madison's signature dishes with more affordable options. We managed to balance the books, explained Rachel, showing the ledgers. What about that charity dinner idea? We already have 5 chefs confirmed and a waiting list of sponsors. How? Madison asked, impressed. Your story with Daniel went viral, Rachel replied hesitantly. The chef who dropped everything to save her sick husband? People could relate. Madison felt her face heat up. What had started out as a business deal had turned into something so much bigger and more significant that she herself sometimes found it hard to process. Amanda Reynolds, the New York Times critic, arrived punctually at 7 p.m. She was a small, elegant woman, with keen eyes that seemed to absorb every detail of her surroundings. "Miss Cooper, or should I say Mrs. Warren," she greeted with a warm smile. "Your story intrigued me, but I confess I'm here mainly because of what I've heard about your food." Madison decided to cook personally for the critic, preparing a selection of dishes that told her story through the flavors. A starter of scallops with apple and ginger sauce, the first dish she served Daniel, followed by a wild mushroom risotto with black truffle, inspired by her conversations about trips to Italy during the long nights in hospital, and ending with a dark chocolate dessert with fleur de sel, representing the bittersweet moments of the last few months. "This is more than food," Amanda commented after the last spoonful. "Each dish tells a story, carries an emotion. It's rare to find such honesty on a menu." While the critic was making her notes, Madison received a message from Charlotte with a photo of Daniel sleeping peacefully, his tablet open with company documents next to it. "He won't stop working, but he's following all the medical recommendations. You're in good hands, dear." The New York Times story was published 2 weeks later, just as Madison was returning to Houston. The headline was simple but impactful: "Love at First Sip. How a Providence chef is redefining the meaning of comfort food." "Did you get to read it?" asked Daniel when she entered his hospital room, carrying a copy of the newspaper. "Not yet," Madison admitted, sitting down in her usual chair next to the bed. "I was too nervous." Daniel picked up the paper and began to read aloud. "In a world where gastronomy often prioritizes spectacle over substance, Cooper's Corner, in its chef-owner Madison Cooper Warren, offers something revolutionarily simple. Food that nourishes not only the body, but also the soul." Madison listened, silent tears streaming down her face, as Daniel continued reading. The review wasn't just about the restaurant or the food. It was about connections, about how sometimes love appears in the most unexpected places, about how life has surprising ways of bringing people together. "You saved my restaurant," she said when he had finished reading. "And you're saving my life," Daniel replied softly, reaching out to dry her tears. "I think we're even." At that moment, watching the man who had walked into her restaurant months ago with an absurd proposal, Madison realized that some love stories begin not with a hope for a kiss, but with a plate of food and a promise of survival. The news came during a virtual meeting of the Warren Enterprises board. Madison was presenting the company's quarterly results when her cell phone vibrated with an urgent message from Charlotte. "Daniel has relapsed. Come quickly." Maintaining the professional composure she had developed over the last few weeks, Madison completed the presentation efficiently, ignoring the trembling in her hands. As soon as the video conference ended, she ran down the corridors of the MD Anderson Cancer Center, her heels echoing against the polished floor. "It's a common complication in patients undergoing this experimental protocol," explained Dr. Martinez when she arrived in the room. "Daniel was unconscious, connected to several monitors. His immune system is reacting to the treatment more intensely than we expected." Charlotte held Madison's hand, which had frozen in the doorway. "He was asking for you before he lost consciousness." The next 48 hours were a blur of medical appointments, tests, and difficult decisions. Madison practically lived in the armchair next to Daniel's bed, alternating between reviewing company documents on her laptop and obsessively researching adverse reactions to experimental treatments. "You need to eat something," Charlotte insisted, bringing a sandwich from the hospital cafeteria. "Daniel wouldn't want to see you like this." Madison accepted the sandwich mechanically, her mind going back to the last conversation she'd had with Daniel before the relapse. They were discussing plans for the future. He wanted to get to know Cooper's Corner better when he returned to Providence, had ideas for expanding the menu, talked about renovating the second floor to create a more intimate space for special dinners. "He can't die," Madison whispered, more to herself than to Charlotte. "Not now that you love him?" Charlotte added gently. Madison nodded, unable to hold back her tears. "How did that happen?" "It was just an agreement." "Love rarely follows contracts," Charlotte smiled sadly. "You know, when Daniel lost his first wife, I thought I'd never see him truly happy again. Then you came along. with your stubborn determination and your heart bigger than Texas." A soft moan from the bed interrupted the conversation. Daniel was waking up, his eyes blinking confusedly in the fluorescent light of the hospital. Madison?" His voice was hoarse. "I'm here." She approached quickly, taking his hand. "Don't talk, you need to rest." "No," he insisted weakly. "I need to tell you, the will." "I don't care about the will," Madison interrupted him firmly. "You're going to survive this, understand? I didn't marry you to inherit anything. I married you because—" She paused, realizing the truth in her own words. "Because you deserve someone who will fight for you as hard as you fought for everything you've built." Dr. Martinez entered the room at that moment, carrying a new battery of tests. His eyes lit up when he saw Daniel conscious. "The news is surprisingly good," he announced after examining Daniel. "The adverse reaction, although frightening, may have enhanced the effect of the treatment. The tumor markers have dropped significantly in the last 48 hours." Madison felt her legs go weak with relief. Charlotte quickly brought her a chair to sit on. "We're not out of the woods yet," the doctor continued, "but if we keep up this progress—" "We will," Daniel said, his voice stronger now. "I still have a lot of plans to carry out." His eyes met Madison's as he said this, and she felt her heart race at the intensity of his gaze. That night, after Daniel had gone back to sleep and Charlotte had gone to the hotel to rest, Madison received a call from Rachel. "How is he?" her friend asked, concern evident in her voice. "Better," Madison replied, watching Daniel's sleeping face. "The treatment is working, even with the setbacks." "And you? How are you?" Madison hesitated. I think I've fallen in love with him, Rachel." "I think everyone already knew that, boss," Rachel laughed softly. "It's just you who took a while to realize it." After hanging up, Madison turned her attention to the company documents she needed to review. Warren Enterprises was thriving under her interim management, to the surprise of many on the board. His experience in running a small business had proved more valuable than any traditional MBA. "You should be sleeping," Daniel's husky voice surprised her. "And so should you," she replied, closing her laptop. "Madison," he hesitated, his eyes searching hers in the dimness of the room. "When all this is over, can we renegotiate our agreement?" She felt her heart stop for a moment. "What kind of renegotiation?" "One where it's not just a contract," he smiled faintly. "One where I can take you to dinner without needing a business excuse. One where I can—" Madison leaned in and kissed him softly, interrupting his words. It was a brief, delicate kiss, full of unspoken promises. "I think we just renegotiated," she whispered against his lips. The heart monitor next to them registered an increase in Daniel's heartbeat, making them laugh softly. "Now go to sleep," she ordered, fluffing her pillows. "We've got a long way to go." As Daniel drifted back to sleep, Madison reflected on how life had curious ways of arranging things. An agreement of convenience had turned into the most unlikely and true love story she could imagine. The news of Daniel's recovery spread quickly through the Providence business circuit. Madison watched the headlines on her tablet as she waited for her flight back to Rhode Island. "Miracle in Houston. CEO Daniel Warren wins battle against cancer." "Ready to go home?" asked Daniel, adjusting the jacket that now looked slightly baggy on his still regaining weight. 3 months after the critical relapse, the experimental treatment had been a success, and the doctors had finally given the go-ahead for them to return. "Home," Madison repeated the word, realizing how its meaning had changed. Providence was no longer just the place where her restaurant was. It was where her new life with Daniel would truly begin. The flight went smoothly, with Daniel sleeping most of the time, his head resting on Madison's shoulder. She took the opportunity to review the latest reports from Warren Enterprises and the updates Rachel had sent about Cooper's Corner. When they landed in Providence, they were surprised by a small crowd at the airport. Company employees, close friends, and, to Madison's surprise, the entire Cooper's Corner team was there, including Rachel holding a banner that read, "Welcome home, Warrens." "I thought it would be a low-key arrival," Madison whispered to Daniel. "Blame my mother," he smiled. Charlotte was never good at keeping things small. Between hugs and tears of welcome, Madison noticed a familiar figure approaching, Caroline Warren. The Newport socialite looked different, less haughty, almost hesitant. "Daniel Madison," she greeted, her voice devoid of its usual condescension. "I came to apologize for everything." Madison felt Daniel tensing beside her, but before he could respond, Caroline continued. "The board showed me the company reports under your management, Madison. Not only have you kept Daniel's legacy intact, but you've expanded it in ways I never imagined possible." "Thank you, Caroline," Madison replied, surprising herself with the sincerity in her voice. "But the credit isn't mine alone. I have an incredible team supporting me." The first stop after the airport was Cooper's Corner. Daniel insisted, saying he needed to see for himself the place that had changed his life. The restaurant was closed to the public, but the lights were on and a familiar aroma filled the air. "Your recipe for mushroom risotto," Rachel explained, guiding them to a specially prepared table. "I thought it would be appropriate for the occasion." As they dined, Madison observed how naturally Daniel interacted with his team, genuinely interested in their stories and dreams. He was no longer the cold businessman who had walked into her restaurant months ago with a business proposal. He was a man transformed by adversity and love. "I have a surprise for you," said Daniel after they had finished dessert. He took an envelope from his inside jacket pocket. "It's not exactly romantic, but—" Madison opened the envelope and found legal documents. Her breath caught as she read the contents. It was a proposal to merge Cooper's Corner with Warren Enterprises' hospitality division, with Madison retaining full creative control and a majority stake. "I don't want it to be just a business deal," Daniel explained, his eyes shining with excitement. "I want to build something together, something that combines the best of both of us." "Like a real marriage?" asked Madison, tears forming in her eyes. "Exactly like a real marriage," he smiled, taking her hand across the table. "If you still want me, of course." Rachel and the restaurant staff, who had discreetly tried to give the couple privacy, couldn't contain their outburst of joy when Madison leaned in to kiss Daniel, sealing not an agreement, but a promise of true love. Later that evening, alone in the apartment above the restaurant, Madison and Daniel planned their future, not just as entrepreneurs or business partners, but as a couple who had found love in the most unlikely places. "You know," said Daniel, watching Madison prepare tea in the small kitchen that he now found more welcoming than any luxurious setting. "When I made that proposal months ago, I was just trying to make sure my legacy stayed in good hands. I didn't imagine I'd find much more than that." Madison smiled, handing him a cup. "And I thought I was just saving my restaurant, but I ended up saving something much more precious." Through the window, the lights of Providence twinkled like earthly stars, silently witnessing the beginning of a new chapter in Madison and Daniel's story. A chapter that promised to be much richer and more meaningful than any business agreement could ever be. Snow was falling softly over Providence as Madison finalized preparations for the most important event ever held at Cooper's Corner. The benefit dinner that had begun as an idea to help the restaurant had turned into a celebration of life, love, and second chances. "Everything's perfect," said Daniel, hugging her from behind as she supervised the staff setting up the tables. 6 months had passed since his return from Houston, and his recovery continued to amaze the doctors. "Almost perfect," corrected Madison, adjusting a flower arrangement. "We're still missing the speech you promised to write." Daniel smiled, that smile that still made her heart leap. "I don't need a written speech to talk about how a stubborn chef saved my life." The lounge at Cooper's Corner was unrecognizable. The merger with Warren Enterprises had allowed for a complete renovation, keeping the original charm but adding modern elements. The second floor, once a dusty warehouse, now housed an intimate space for special events. Rachel coordinated the 5 guest chefs in the kitchen, each preparing a special dish for the tasting menu. The charity event would raise funds for research into experimental cancer treatments at Rhode Island Hospital. "Madison," Charlotte called out, entering the room with an old box in her hands. "I found this in Daniel's first wife's things. I think she'd like you to have it." Inside the box was a handwritten recipe book, the pages yellowed by time. "Recipes for Healing the Soul." Read the title in Charlotte Warren's delicate handwriting. "She started writing when she got ill," Charlotte explained softly. "She said that food had healing powers beyond the physical." Madison flipped through the pages carefully, finding not just recipes, but little notes about special moments, loved ones, hopes, and dreams. It was more than a cookbook. It was a testimony of love. The guests began to arrive at 7 o'clock sharp. The cream of Providence society mingled with doctors, researchers, and ordinary people who had been touched by Madison and Daniel's story. Caroline Warren arrived, accompanied by Dr. Phillips from Houston, who had flown in especially for the event. "I've never seen a recovery like Daniel's," the doctor commented during the cocktail party. "Medicine did its part, but there was something else, a will to live that appeared when you came into his life." Madison watched Daniel circulate among the guests, his healthy, animated face so different from that pale businessman who had proposed a marriage of convenience a year ago. He stopped to talk to some patients undergoing treatment who had been specially invited to the event. "Attention, please," Daniel's voice rang out through the hall, making everyone turn to him. "I know I promised a formal speech about the importance of medical research and how the funds raised today will make a difference, but I want to talk about something more personal." He paused, his eyes meeting Madison's. "A year ago, I walked into this restaurant with a business proposition. I was dying, and I wanted to ensure that my legacy remained in good hands. What I didn't know was that I would find much more than a competent heiress. I would find someone who would teach me that living is worth more than any legacy." Madison felt tears forming in her eyes as Daniel continued. "Madison not only saved my life with her determination to find treatment, but she showed me how to truly live. Through her food, her love of life, and her ability to see beauty in the simplest things, she healed me in ways that no medical treatment could." The whole room was silent, absorbing every word. Rachel discreetly passed a handkerchief to Madison, who hadn't even realized she was crying. "So today," Daniel raised his glass, "we're not just raising funds for medical research, we're celebrating the power of true love, the kind that transcends contracts and conventions. We're celebrating second chances and new beginnings." After the speech, dinner was served. Each dish told a story, from the first risotto Madison had prepared for Daniel to creations inspired by her journey in Houston. Charlotte Warren's cookbook had inspired the dessert menu, a bread pudding with salted caramel that, according to the notes, warms the heart on the coldest days. Towards the end of the evening, while the guests were enjoying coffee and digestives, Daniel pulled Madison to a quieter corner of the room. "Remember when we renegotiated our deal in Houston?" he asked, holding her hands. "Well, I want to propose one last renegotiation." Before Madison could reply, he knelt down, ignoring the excited whispers of the nearby guests. "Madison Cooper Warren, would you agree to marry me again? This time without contracts, without agreements, just because I love you more than anything in this life?" Madison laughed through her tears. "You know we're already married, right?" "Yes," he smiled. "But now I want to do it right, with a white dress, flowers, heartfelt vows, and everything else you deserve." "Yes," she replied, pulling him into a kiss that was met with applause from the guests. 1,000 times yes. Cooper's Corner continued to grow, but retained its welcoming essence. The merger with Warren Enterprises allowed Madison to expand her concept of food that heals the soul to other establishments, always maintaining the personal touch that had made her special. Daniel made a full recovery, although he still had regular checkups. He learned to cook with Madison, discovering that there was healing not only in eating good food, but in preparing it with love. Charlotte Warren's cookbook took on a special place in the couple's kitchen, its pages now supplemented with new recipes and memories created by Madison and Daniel. It was a testament to how love, like good food, has the power to transform, heal, and nourish the soul. And so, what had begun as an agreement of convenience became the truest of love stories, proving that sometimes the most unlikely ingredients create the most perfect recipes.